Welcome to this week's edition of the Harness Racing Alumni Show. I'm Freddie Hudson, and I'm here with Bob Marks and Andy Cohen.
The Harness Racing Alumni Show with your hosts, Freddie Hudson and Trade Martin.
This week's Alumni Show is brought to you by Bill Houghton, insuring standardbreds and farms for over 40 years. Bill knows the ins and outs of equine insurance. Make sure your equine investments are protected. Call or text Bill at 954-655-5547. That's 954-655-5547. Call Bill now. Andy is going to interview Lisa Lazarus, the Executive Director of the Horseracing Integrity and Safety Authority. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Fred. I appreciate it. And thank you, Lisa, for being here. We know that your schedule, especially these days, is quite busy. So we appreciate you taking a few minutes to answer some questions and to tell us a little bit about yourself. You were named to the HISA board as the Chief Executive Officer, I guess, effective in February. And obviously it's a monumental task of getting this organization up and running and dealing with the federal regulations and all of the players within the horse racing community for a start later this year. And so I guess I just wanted to, since this is an audience of harness racing people, of folks who have an interest in standardbreds, try to help introduce you to them and maybe try to get you to answer a few questions that I know many folks in our corner of the horse racing world have about HISA and about the federal law and about what's going to happen. But my first question is more of a personal one. You were able to achieve what I could only dream of achieving, which is to combine a legal degree and a law background with horses. So tell us a little bit, if you can, briefly, about your history of involving yourself in equestrian organizations really around the world. The Federation Equestre Internationale, the international governing body for equestrian sports, and other horse-related things. How did you come to that, and were you able to blend those two, I guess, passions, the law and horses?
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really delighted to be here. And, standardbreds and harness racing are an incredibly important part of the horse racing community. And it's really a privilege to be able to sort of speak to your world directly. To start with, to answer the first question, so I've always loved horses. I mean, I wasn't a competitive rider, but I grew up sort of exposed to horses. My grandfather was a horseman, and I adored him, and he sort of loved taking me to the races. And actually, funny enough, so I grew up in Montreal, Canada, and the one racetrack that we had near us was a racetrack called Blue Bonnet, and they had harness racing. So that's really the only racing I was sort of exposed to as a kid. But after that, I left Canada, and I went to university at Penn in the U.S., and I went to Fordham Law School in the city. And so I really sort of started to make my adult life in the U.S. And after spending 4 years at a law firm in the labor and employment section, the law firm of Aiken Gump, actually, I ended up as in-house counsel at the NFL, the National Football League. They were a client of Aiken Gump, so I had been working on a lot of their matters, as outside counsel, including a number of doping-related issues, obviously human doping-related issues, but that's when I first sort of got my feet wet in the doping world, and spent 10 years there really digging into sports regulatory issues and matters. And for personal reasons, my family moved overseas to Switzerland, and it was at that point that I got a call from a recruiter, really, saying that the International Equestrian Federation, the world governing body for sport horses, was looking for a general counsel. And that seemed like, a terrific fit to me and very exciting. And even though to be honest, I didn't know very much about some of the disciplines, because the FEI governs not just, the Olympic ones that most of us know, like show jumping, 3-day eventing, and dressage, but they also govern disciplines such as reining, vaulting, endurance, driving as well, like carriage driving. So that was a sort of exciting area to learn and open my eyes to all of the different, essentially, disciplines with sport horses. And I spent about 4 years as general counsel there, where this is probably where my experience that is most relevant to the task at hand was developed, in that I after the Beijing Olympic Games, there were a number of positive positive tests in show jumping horses, and so there was a bit of a crisis and some concern that equestrian's place in the Olympic movement would be in jeopardy. And so I was sort of charged with revamping and restructuring the equine anti-doping program and essentially, making sure that it had all of the hallmarks of integrity and thoroughness and professionalism. And then actually I could get 133 at that time national federations, so different countries on board and accepting of the new program. And so that took a number of years to do. And then afterwards, I actually took on for the FEI the Chief of Business Development and Strategy position, where I was actually overseeing all of the commercial elements of sport horses. So I really got the chance I was very fortunate to kind of touch my hand in a number of different areas. And then when I left that position, also because we moved back to the U.S., it was sort of a natural transition to start representing horsemen actually in sport horses. So I did that for 4 years, which was great because it gave me a whole other perspective and the ability to understand, really what this is obviously in sport horses, not racing, but what the challenges that trainers, owners, riders, breeders have, and it sort of gave me I felt a chance to have a really 360 understanding of equestrian sports. So I come into, I think it's important, maybe even for everyone to understand, that I come into this role with, a firm understanding of sports governance and also how equine welfare programs work and equine anti-doping programs work. But I don't come into it with a robust understanding or a robust experience in racing, either in thoroughbred or in standardbred. So I have a bit of a clean slate. In that regard, of course, I understand the basics and I'm educating myself. But that's not my background, and so I do think that gives me, some advantage to kind of look at things from a different lens, whereby I feel like I have the technical expertise to develop plans and to provide advice and recommendations to my board. But I have a bit of a blank piece of paper to kind of reconsider some of the issues, and then of course I have a number of very experienced and trustworthy people on the team who do have, that deep racing experience.
Well, it's certainly unique to have somebody in your position who spent years as an advocate for people who are subjected to regulatory rules, right? To have somebody
exactly.
who was on the other side of it, facing suspension or medication or whatever. And I think that's a point that a lot of folks in harness racing aren't aware with. Let me just back up for 1 second. I grew up
Sure.
in TMR. I grew up in TMR. Which
Did you really?
Yes. It was
no.
10 minutes from Bluebonnets. When were you?
You did not.
Yeah.
Oh
when were you?
What a crazy coincidence.
It is.
So I like in the 70s and early 80s,
Yeah. I was.
Yeah.
We were there. Yeah, my dad had horses there from 1970 to 1979, and we moved to the States. So it sounds like we were probably at the track around the same time. Did you spend a lot of time at Bluebonnets? Were your folks as excited about racing there as my folks were?
So it's funny that you say that because my dad absolutely loved racing, and I'm the oldest of 3 girls, and my dad, on Sundays, my parents had a bit of a traditional marriage, so Sunday was my dad's day to take care of me. Until I was about 8 or 9, he would take me to Bluebonnets, and he would tell me to tell my mom that we were at the zoo for the day. And so I would come home and she'd say, "Oh, what'd you guys do?" And I'd be like, "Oh, went to the zoo. It was amazing. We saw the animals. They ran around." And literally, it was only, when I turned 9 or 10 that I realized it was actually not the zoo when I went to the zoo for the first time. But no, I used to hang out with them for the day, and I loved it. It was amazing. It's actually so sad. Yeah. My dad still lives in Montreal, in Hampstead, and I still, I drive by that area all the time, and it's sort of sad to see that it's no longer there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, we can talk about that some other time off the air.
Sure.
I'll be interested to hear more of your story. So tell us a little bit. We've been involved in sort of monitoring the federal law since before it was enacted, and there's a lot. The law, as you know, has divided the harness racing community. On the one hand is the USTA, the United States Trotting Association, whose leaders are adamantly opposed to it for a variety of reasons. And then there are hundreds of other stakeholders in the industry, including some of the largest owners and breeders and trainers who are open-minded about the federal law. Maybe there are some concerns about it. There are some questions about it. Obviously, not a lot of the details have come out so far, but they are at least open-minded to the idea that some sort of federal regulatory regime is going to make things uniform and really crack down on what most people in the industry see are major integrity problems and major failings of state racing commissions. And so I guess the first question to you as we get a little bit closer, in the 4 or 5 months since you've been brought on board, is there any surprise that you've come across or any reason to think that the mission of the federal law, the mission of HISA, the authority, is different than trying to bring a measure of aggressive enforcement to try to rein in some of the integrity issues that we have?
So first of all, I've only been in the job for 2 months.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Should I correct that?
I gave you a promotion.
Aside. Thank you. So, no, I mean, listen, there isn't. Have I realized the complexity? Absolutely. And I probably, to some extent, realized that, when I was hired, it was going to be complex. But now I actually can visualize and live the complexity, which is a little bit different. And I can identify where the complexities sort of live. At the end of the day, my view, and this includes the USTA folks, many of whom I've met, who I think, are good people and are just trying to essentially kind of do what they think is right for their sport. At the end of the day, I think it's an industry that is really, it seems to me it's almost like a big family, and maybe, standardbreds and thoroughbreds are sort of, different families within a bigger ecosystem. But for the most part, what I've encountered is people who want the best for the industry, and there's just a disagreement about how to get there, and what the right paths are. And I obviously firmly believe in the federal legislation and the federal oversight, because basically every successful sport has a central governing body. You can argue over whether or not Congress stepping in was the right move, but at the end of the day, the industry never was able to come together and agree on binding regulation across the country. And that makes it really the only sport, I would say, almost in the world that I can think of that operates that way. And that lack of uniformity, I think, is really, makes it really difficult for the sport to be governed in a way that one, I think, taps into all its potential, but two, that allows for consistent integrity checks and balances, and also potentially enough bringing together of resource and expertise to make sure that we're doing the very best for the horse. And in that regard, I'm sort of focusing on our racetrack safety program. So nothing's changed about, to answer your question, nothing's changed about my sense of the commitment of the main stakeholders. I think, what's going to be challenging for me and continues to be challenging for me is trying to get everyone on the same page more or less and working together towards a common goal. And what the sort of mantra that I tell my team and that I generally espouse is, we are going to bend over backwards to work with anybody who wants to work with us and to try to find, solutions to make this workable in every state and with every, breed, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's federal law. And so at some point in time, my obligation to implement the federal law kicks in. It isn't optional, At least, obviously at this stage, it's only federal law for the thoroughbreds. But ultimately, it is federal law. And we want to do it cooperatively. We want to do it in a way that maximizes efficiencies and uses the resource that already exists. But at the end of the day, my job is to implement. I didn't write the law, but my job is to implement it. So
when you talk about the efficiency, economic efficiency, it raises one of the prime questions or the prime concerns that harness racing folks have, which is the cost. Mm-hmm. I think that there's almost like an historical paranoia when it comes to standardbreds versus thoroughbred interests, mm-hmm. where the standardbreds have felt like, I don't want to say bullied, but like the small brother and the big brother, and have sort of been pushed around. And I think mm-hmm. one of the things we've heard, even from people who are very open-minded about HISA and are hopeful that there's going to be a federal regime, the concern is that because harness horses race so much more often, because standardbreds can race 30 to 40 times a year, that somehow the formula to evaluate the cost of this enforcement is going to come down more heavily. Now, I don't think that's in the law. I think the law makes it very clear that thoroughbreds pay for thoroughbreds and standardbreds pay for standardbreds. But what can you say to reassure people that at this point there's no indication that there's going to be some exorbitant increase in the cost of enforcement that somehow horsemen, horsewomen, trainers, owners, breeders are going to pay for?
Yeah, so there's a few things I'll say to that. One is, and I've told this to a number of different groups, I am very sensitive to the cost concerns. Our leadership is very sensitive to the cost concerns, and we want to make the industry better. And if it's not going to make it better if we bring in a program that's not affordable, and you see tracks closing down. That's not like what success looks like. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that the standardbreds are kind of in a bit of a privileged position right now, I would say, because they can sort of watch for a year or so, hopefully not much longer than a year or so, how things go for the thoroughbreds, and how the program actually gets implemented and what that looks like from a cost standpoint, and make judgments. 3, you're right, that the Act simply prohibits any subsidizing either way. So the standardbreds, are not allowed by the Act to subsidize or contribute to the thoroughbred program, and vice versa. But what I'm seeing, again, it's very early, and I'm still sort of finding my way forward and figuring out what the right solutions are. What I am seeing on the thoroughbred side is that there are lots of efficiencies that we can achieve. Most of these state racing commissions, or all of them, I should say, have budgets for testing, right? And if we can create, a uniform program, which is what we're going to do, and we build in those efficiencies, I'm actually hopeful that costs will either stay the same or even come down in those jurisdictions that are already doing a lot of testing and running efficient programs. For those jurisdictions that are not, obviously costs are going to go up because they have to come up to the level of their more, of their sort of peer states that are doing robust testing. But for those states like New York, New Jersey, who are really actually doing a fair amount, my hope is that when we achieve these efficiencies, it's not going to increase costs. And then the benefit is going to be a genuine lifting up of the industry overall vis-a-vis the public, and hopefully that brings, financial benefit to the industry.
Thanks for that question. I think that helps folks understand where we are in this process. One of the other concerns, and I think you said this a couple of weeks ago when we had our broader conversation, is when it comes to medication rules. I don't think there's very much controversy on the standardbred side when it comes to safety rules. I think that there's a lot of consensus about the need for safe tracks and so forth. Maybe there's going to be some requests to tweak the rules about riding crops versus whips because of the the nature of racing. But there are some concerns that because standardbreds are different than thoroughbreds, because they race differently, they're conformed differently, they're trained differently, that there should be at least some tweaks to medication rules. And I know that you can't guarantee that there's going to be a different, medication rules that apply to standardbreds versus thoroughbreds. But is your sense that there's going to be an openness to consider arguments made by standardbred owners and breeders and interest holders who say, listen, we're 90% of the way with you, but because of the differences in the way that these animals operate, we have to have slightly different medication rules. Is that something you guys are open to? Is that something that you will at least consider at some point when the time is right and the standardbred industry moves forward towards getting under this umbrella of the federal regulations?
Yes, and these are board decisions, so I can only kind of give you what my viewpoint is. Obviously, some of the board, supporting this philosophy, but I think they would. And what I would say to that is we're going to be guided by the science. So absolutely, we're going to be open to it because we're going to have one of the kind of hallmarks of the new program is going to be having a scientific director, and there'll be, we have a committee in the board as well, the Anti-Medication Control Committee, that will look at these questions and will look at essentially, what the science and research shows us about what's appropriate and what is, what we need to do to maintain the integrity of the standardbred program, for example, if we get to that point. And if that means that because of the different, nature of the sports and the fact that, as you said, standardbreds run much more frequently than thoroughbreds and probably, and I understand, don't have the same, sort of impact as, running a thoroughbred race, obviously,
right,
seems to be a lot more, a lot more.
It's a lot more dangerous.
Exactly. So all of those things will for sure be taken into consideration. And if you're asking about LASIK, we're gonna commission our study this summer or sometime later this year, and again we're going to be guided by the findings of that study, and that applies to both standardbreds and thoroughbreds.
I just have two more questions because I know
Sure.
that Fred wants to keep this short. I'm an owner and I'm a breeder, and I'm eternally frustrated that horses and trainers and owners who clearly have some sort of an edge are never caught, and they just continue in perpetuity to basically steal money from other owners and trainers and breeders and so forth. And I think that I've learned enough from my experience in the sport and from listening to Travis Tigert, for example, and others who are specialists in this kind of thing, that there's only so much the testing can do, that the people who are using illegal, illicit drugs seem to be always a step or two ahead of the testing, and that one of the more efficient ways of catching folks who are cheating is not necessarily to focus only on testing, but to focus on forensic accounting and investigations and other sorts of traditional law enforcement methods that, wiretaps, that basically catch people in a different way. And I'm wondering if that's a vision that you guys are thinking about and talking about as you negotiate with USADA and other entities to figure out who's going to do your enforcement.
That is, I have to tell you, within the top three things that I'm thinking about in terms of the enforcement agency. So there are lots of different components that go into an effective anti-doping program. And when you're talking about medication overages, we all know that's a very different animal and a very different proposition than catching cheaters. Medication overages are a problem, and there should be sanctions for them, in my view, but it's different than those who are actually intentionally doping horses for a performance advantage. And I absolutely share your view that testing only does so much. I mean, you need to have a certain amount of testing in place as a deterrent, because I think, taking it away creates, potential holes for cheaters to walk through. But ultimately, what you really need is intelligence-based testing, which is testing that is, pursuant to investigations, leads, information that you have about a particular trainer or horse. And it's those intelligence-based testing formulas that yield, positive results in terms of finding and determining, who's not playing by the rules. And one of the things that we planned, because we have obviously a finite, like anything else, it's got a finite amount of money. And, one of my jobs and one of our responsibilities is to make sure that the money that we use from the industry is used as effectively and efficiently as possible. And my personal view is that a lot of that has to be in investigations and intelligence, because otherwise we're not going to be able to achieve, the goals that we want to achieve. And we've got to be making sure that we're prioritizing how that money's spent. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Sure. Two more quick questions. Are you any closer to selecting an enforcement organization? And when we talked a couple of weeks ago, you said we should expect something in May, and I guess we're not quite in May, so I'm jumping the gun. But do you want to break any news today and tell us if you've come to a conclusion, or are you inching closer?
Unfortunately, I cannot break any news today, but we are very close. And my response that we announced something in May is still accurate, and I expect it will be closer to the beginning of May than the end. So I'm hoping in the next few weeks.
Awesome. That's great. My last question to you, and I promise it is the last. So
no problem.
I would say there are, and I promise Freddie that this is the last. So I would guess that there's, a third of the people in harness racing are following the lead of the USTA. I think that a lot of those folks have not been given full information about what HISA is and what it intends to do. And I think a third of the people are very supportive of the federal legislation. They like I said before, see it as an opportunity for a fresh start and to really generate not just changes to the integrity of policing of the sport, but to allow the sport to turn to a public faith, and especially legislators who are helping fund harness racing and say, listen, we are on board with cleaning up. We realize we have to clean things up. But I think that there's this middle percentage of folks, maybe 20%, maybe 30%, who just aren't sure, right? They're skeptical of federal authority because of their politics, maybe. They're a little skeptical of change. Maybe they're doing well. And so to those people in the standardbred industry, you say what?
I say watch the thoroughbred experience, and make your decision then. Because you're in a bit of a privileged position by not being mandatorily governed from the outset. And I think if you're actually watching what's happening in the industry, I think you would notice that there's been a bit of a shifting of tide, and a number of our detractors or previous detractors are now actually supporting us and coming on board and sort of understanding that we don't have this philosophy of govern from the top down and irrespective of what the needs are of the various jurisdictions or tracks or horsemen, that we're actually really actively engaged in trying to understand what's best for the industry. That's our job. HISA's job is to protect the integrity of the industry and the safety of the horse. And we can only do that effectively if we get the people who care about those things sort of on board and working with us. Now, we're never going to get everyone on board, and there's always going to be those who are uncomfortable, who are detractors, for whatever reason. But I think that you'll continue to see a lot more openness from HISA, and it's not that we didn't want to be open before. It's that there was so much work to be done in a short period of time that wasn't the priority. Was actually getting the work done. But now we have plans. We have relationships. We have we'll soon have an enforcement agency. We have the racetrack safety program that's launching on July 1. You may have read that, again, on the thoroughbred side, that California and Minnesota have already both opted in to both paying the assessment and entering into our voluntary agreements. We expect to have a number more states announce that they're going to do so this week and next week. And many of those states were states that were, firmly against us in the beginning, but now realize that we really do want to work cooperatively with them to basically achieve what we all want, which is, better industry, safer, horses that are protected and sort of live longer and are injury free. So that's what I would say to those that are on the fence. Watch and make your own judgment. Don't be influenced by anyone whispering in your ear, but watch what actually happens, and make a judgment based on that experience.
Well, thank you for this. Will you promise us that once you make that enforcement agency decision, you'll come back on and just spend a few more minutes to give us an update?
I absolutely promise.
If you're buying or selling your home, Joe Rico is your go-to guy. Joe has been representing buyers and sellers on Long Island for 30 years. He is an expert in all types of sales. Don't settle for average. Call or text Joe Rico today at 516-524-4870. That's Joe Rico at 516-524-4870.
You know what, Freddie? Give everybody Joe's email address.
That's Joe Rico, C21@yahoo.com. The Standardbred Retirement Foundation has been rescuing and caring for standardbreds since 1989. They now have over 470 horses in their care. Find out how you can help. Visit adoptahorse.org, the Standardbred Retirement Foundation. Andy, thank you so much for being this week's guest host. And Lisa, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. That's a wrap of this week's show. Don't forget to tune in next week.
The Harness Racing Alumni Show